The year is 1973 in Toyohiro Kusaporo, Japan. Two brothers, Yuji and Hiroshi Kudo, attempted to open a small cafe, but the building they rented already had one. So after some scrambling about, they landed on the idea of a ham radio shop seemingly at the 11th hour. This wasn't too far off from a previous venture attempted years before, where Yuji tried his hand at a side hustle, selling pictures he took of trains under the name Hudson Production. This failed due to a lack of experience in earning and/or handling capital funds and finding people he could trust, named after their favorite kinds of trains. Their new company was called CQ Hudson. This time around, the two were going to persist in their vision, even to the point where Hiroshi dropped out of the Hokkaido Gakuin University of Law to join his brother. When things looked to be going the same way as last time, CQ somehow managed to catch a rather lucky break in the form of newer digital mediums. Near the end of the decade, Yuji actually took a trip to the US after hearing about the boom of hobbyists putting together their own programs through a magazine, bringing back a PC of his own. After scoping out things a bit for himself, the decision was made for CQ to start developing and selling software of their own. What I hadn't told you earlier was that Yuji was actually a graduate of the Nihon University's engineering program and was formerly an employee of an unnamed company in Nagoya, so programming was kind of his thing. By the early 1980s, they began to develop and sell newfound hardware such as HuBasic, an interpreter of the basic coding module for OSs such as Human 68K of Sharp's X6800 series. Up to that point, if one wanted to program their own software, they had to do coding themselves. But thanks to BASIC, the fundamental stuff could be handled for programmers, allowing them to focus on literally anything else. That said, it then should come as no surprise that programmers had to be recruited from universities to help the company go forward. From then on, the company itself began to evolve, taking up numerous iterations of this really neat V logo, obviously based off of the famous Muhammad Ali quote, and developing numerous bits of hardware to varying levels of success. All things considered, one could say with all this newly gained main power and emerging resume that these guys were starting to do fairly well for themselves. This isn't to say all was well, even at that point though, as it's been said numerous times before that they were selling up to 30 small games per month, the majority of which barely broke past 10,000 sales. Either way, before long, they were known as one of the most notable software producers in Japan, especially amongst those of a certain up-and-coming company's first hit video game console. And all this was in no thanks to one small bean-shaped bomber.
By Hudson!
In 1983, there were two extremely important games in development. One was a port of Rotobun's hit title Lode Runner for the Nintendo Famicom, and the other was an experimental new title for older PCs. Practically rebuilt from the ground up, this newer version of Lode Runner came into being under the eye of one Shinichi Nakamoto, one of the many recruits I spoke of earlier. The game would receive many changes, such as the insertion of 28 new levels on top of the original 32, actual scrolling screens courtesy of the Famicom's better architecture, and actual music. The most notable thing out of all this though, was a huge graphical overhaul which made things look more cartoony, but then again, literally anything is an expansion to the original look, which, in brief, the game itself stars an unnamed thief taking back stolen treasure from a gang of other thieves, Indiana Jones style while being pursued by guards. You run around a plethora of vertically based labyrinths where you climb up ladders, settle across ceilings, and dig holes to trap said guards and to use as bridges, and sometimes steal their possessions to get from one place to another. Speaking of, keep note of this one sprite's head right here. The game was applauded by many at the time for its possible number of strategies in playing. It also had one of the first level editors to ever be seen in a video game. When released, this rendition went on to sell 1.2 million copies, marking Hudson Soft's very first success. One of said smaller titles pumped out earlier in Hudson's run was a simple yet addictive arcade-style game called Bakugan Otoko, or Bomberman as it's better known as. You play as a fellow in overalls as he made his way through numerous grid-based mazes, defeating a series of balloon enemies to advance. His weapon of choice happened to be bombs that can blow up blocks or enemies that get in his way. These bombs explode in crosses, but only for a certain range. It's with that a bit of strategy is immediately set up. If you either get back far enough or hide behind diagonally placed blocks, you wouldn't get hurt. But if you time your bomb placements right, then your enemies would. At the same time, you have to be carefully explorative, if that makes any sense. Under some blocks, you'll find either fruits or other goodies that can increase your score, or the exit to that stage. If you accidentally nuke said exit, you'll be met by 4 or 5 more enemies that'll pursue you. This game didn't exactly sell, so off into the bin it was thrown. That and...
See, look. Isn't that...
This wouldn't stop a spirited Nakamoto from eventually finding this game while looking through older properties to potentially revive. And so... Before we go on, I want to go a little out of order here if you don't mind, and point out a few things. Firstly, massive shout out to the Bomberpedia for putting together such a surprisingly well-made website, in which nearly all the information I've compiled throughout this series can easily be found. That said, a lot of it is very much still work in progress, so do be patient with those working on this. That said, I am at the same time appalled that this place doesn't have any kind of forum or something where people can contribute to any kind of ongoing discussion, not even so much as a dead Discord server. Yes, I am very much proposing that we make one, by the way. For anyone interested in actually getting something along these lines going, please do hit me up in any of the options listed down in the description below. I feel as if one connected to the wiki would be nice. Secondly, massive ups to the Bomberman board forums, in particular Twitter user Kirobon for helping find and ultimately transcribe the entirety of the spin-off Vitaman Bakugaiden anime series. I wanted to save that bit for a later video, but screw it. If it weren't for this man right here, I would know next to nothing about this surprisingly huge sub-series. Same for those like Sora G. Silverwood for scanlating the numerous Bomberman manga. I really thought the preceding Bakugaiden and Jetter's books were the only ones until earlier today as of recording this. And finally, thank you to all of those following me on Twitter and other social media. I did not know this series already has such an enamored and closely knit fan base, and I for one am now glad to be part of it. Oh, and don't worry, Bonk and Adventure Island fans, I'll be taking care of you all sooner than later. With that, let's get back to the show. And so, in one 72-hour binge sometime before the end of 1985, Nakamoto proceeded to also completely remake Bomberman from the ground up, albeit to a far larger extent. While the actual gameplay itself remained largely the same, a few crucial changes were made. Firstly, the actual graphics received quite the overhaul, including the downright replacement of the original character himself. Taken right from Lode Runner, the robotic guard I spoke of earlier became the game's main character, and the enemies were made a bit cuter to help things stand out. On the technical side, screen scrolling was also tacked on here, as well as a few power-ups to spicing things up a bit, but most notably was the addition of a theme song of sorts, composed by newcomer Jun Chikuma. We'll also be covering her and many other artists who've contributed to the series in another video. An addition I bet nobody saw coming was the inclusion of an actual story, especially one that linked both this and Lode Runner together. taking place both prior to Lode Runner and well before every game after this. It describes Bomberman as a disgruntled worker trapped within the deep confines of an evil underground labyrinth. He grows weary of producing bombs non-stop, wishing to escape. After hearing of the rumor of those seeing the world above becoming human, he takes the initiative to break free. At the end of the game, it blatantly shows us that he becomes the main character of another Hudson Soft title. This game would go on to sell over 1 million copies, spawning a remake with these features back in the original PCs. The next game up to bat is arguably where the series actually came into its own, sometimes even being mistaken for the first game. Released on December 7th, 1990 for PCs like the TurboGrafx-16, Bomberman is a total reimagining of sorts of the last game. This actually paved the way for the entire series, setting up the 8-world and boss structure, as well as bringing Shikuma back on to compose many more tunes, nearly all of which would go on to be leitmotifed in literally every game from on here, introducing the series' main multiplayer modes, and creating an actual mythos. The game in of itself is actually quite pretty for its time, which is in no small thanks to the greatly expanded color palette of the TurboGrafx-16. The generally better sound chips involved also gave way to better sounding music. The difficulty was also beefed up with negative power-ups that provided detrimental effects to the player, and adding 20 plus enemies onto a stage to bomb rush you if a stage wasn't completed on time. The design of Bomberman himself received its first revision here, with the squatted human-like bodies being placed by more ovular ones. Same for the heads with openings for simplified black eyes to come through. The light blue color that implied he was wearing visors have now been replaced with human skin tones, showing that they're cyborgs of some kind. Actual color palettes now exist, as well as the intentional use of the ball-shaped heads once influenced by the possible lack of artistic ability. As for the story, it gives us a general look at the current day Bomberman. It shows that he and his twin Black are two cyborgs built by one Dr. Mitsumori, with the ability to think and feel for themselves, a la Mega Man X. However, a glitch in Black's programming causes him to go rogue and kidnap the Doctor's daughter Lisa. White proceeds to go after he and his followers, ending up in his deep, dark castle. Black's defeat at the end presumably ignites a long-lasting sibling rivalry between the two. His existence, alongside the introduction of red, blue, and green, establishes that entirely different characters can be made just by recoloring the main one. This is something that we'll see much more of later on. The final game we'll be covering today is the proper sequel to the first game, which came 8 years after the original, Bomberman 2 on the Famicom. While not as refined as the last game, which isn't exactly a surprise, 2 stuck closely to what was set up. The power-ups, extra enemy variety, and the multiplayer all still exist, if just in a truncated form. Shikuma returns once more to produce more tracks, some of which are those remixes I forewarned of earlier. However, there are some alternate ones that play whenever the player happens to be in an alternative state. The game itself also looks really good for a Famicom title. Maybe it's just me, but the shadows underneath Bomberman and the surprisingly smooth explosion effects really get me. The game starts with White on a commute when the returning Black zips by him, leaving a bag of money from a robbed bank by his side. This leads to him being framed and incarcerated. White busts his way out and confronts Black. Admittedly, there isn't much in this aspect. And that brings us to a close for today. Next time, we'll be talking about the games released in the 90s, primarily the Super Bomberman series and the N64 titles. Then, before heading into the 2000s, we'll be sidestepping into a look at the series' numerous anime and manga, as well as the artists involved in bringing the series to life. Until next time, I'll be seeing you on the other side of the boom. Alright, bathroom time, let's go!